Chapter 1. Thomas Brisbane. The 2nd of December, 1822.
Dear King George IV, it is with great pleasure that I inform you the governing of New South Wales has been faring well. Despite the occasional trials and tribulations, I am watching the new colony begin to flourish and take great rapture in the knowledge that Great Britain will be supported by our efforts. But I also must express concerns that I have of a most sincere and severe nature. The fleets arriving to our shores bear a disproportionate quantity of convicts to free settlers. More and more frequently, I note the change to be more pronounced. The convicts that arrived most recently I have noted to be particularly a most lazy, hardened breed of men. Their service, if it can be even called of such, has been lacking on the best of days. On the worst, I would deem it to be a nuisance of the highest degree. I must be forthright. Free settlers are needed in greater numbers to build the colony that I wish to share with Great Britain. It is for that reason that, with your permission, I wish to request that we—
Sir, we have a problem.
What might that be?
Well, sir, there has been an escape. A huge band of convicts are escaping.
Sir Thomas Brisbane frantically jumped out of his chair and, with the vigour of a man 20 years his junior, he hurried over to Henry at the door.
We're not going to allow another escape,
he said in a stern voice. Brisbane looked fiercely at Henry, and in return he was met with a look of sincere concern. But there was something more inside Henry's expression which was difficult to read. It was throwing kindling into the rage that was building inside of Brisbane. Henry gulped, gave a feeble nod, and dashed from the door. Brisbane followed from close behind, running down the hallways until the pair reached a balcony that looked over the colony of Port Jackson. From their vantage point on the hill, they looked out upon the spattering of colonial buildings, the vessels and the hulks docked in the port.
There they are, sir.
Henry pointed at a massive gathering, a coursing mass forcing its way through the thoroughfares of the colony at great speed. They bore tattered clothes, but they were armed heavily.
See the carriages, sir?
Brisbane did not respond. His deep, burning rage was frightful, and his temple was pulsing heavily. It was taking all his willpower to not burst out in anger.
Supplies.
Henry added tentatively to his unanswered question.
Ammunition and weapons, too.
Brisbane, however, was more occupied with other details. He was scouring the streets in search of some hope. As if he had read his mind, Henry gestured out to a little pocket within the thoroughfares.
Look over there, sir.
Brisbane's eyes fell upon soldiers in full-dress uniform of dazzling red who were taking up hiding positions near the mass of convicts. Within an instant, the men straightened up from behind their crates and, after cocking their rifles, released a round into the coursing mass. 5 convicts fell. The mass seemed suspended in time for a brief moment. Then suddenly, its attention shifted toward the source. Weapons fired, and the hollow crates were splintered. On the other side, the men in red uniform toppled to the ground and remained still. Brisbane swore.
Bloody convict!
He uttered through clenched teeth. His men were too thinly spread, making them ineffective against the sheer strength of their opposition. They were little more than moths to the flame.
Henry, I need you to regroup the guard on the southerly outskirts of the colony. We need greater numbers to block their escape.
But how will I—
Do it now, soldier. Travel through town and inform every man, woman and child yourself if need be. Gather militia. We are not accepting defeat.
With a brief,
Yes, sir.
Henry turned and made his leave to fulfill his orders. Further rifle fire drew Brisbane's attention. He watched more red soldiers topple over to meet the same fate as their earlier comrades. Looking beyond the havoc, he noticed that the sun was starting to rise to a clear, cloudless sky. There was a sharp contrast in the beauty of the surrounding landscape, the estuary and the sea. Bounding up the hill to his residence, Governor House, Brisbane noticed a familiar face, speckled with sweat and a balding, blonde pate. This man came up to give a formal salute from the base of the balcony.
Lieutenant Hicks,
Brisbane addressed him.
I will need your skills near the battlefield. Assemble our men and get them to fire on the convicts from the neighbouring buildings. We are useless fighting this force from head on and in the open. Gather numbers, gather them fast, then bring the fight back to these men."
With that, Hicks gave a curt nod, a crisp salute, and ran back down the hill at a tremendous pace. Brisbane turned around and went back inside the governor's house, and as he did this, he heard the colony's warning bell begin to sound. Brisbane scowled. He thought the bell was ludicrous in the current situation. The entire colony would already be well aware of the danger that was afoot due to all of the hullabaloo. As he walked through Governor House, Brisbane tripled his pace, flying past corridors until he reached his destination. The house was well known among the rioting convicts. It was too risky to stay. He inserted a small, ornamental-looking key and turned the lock. Inside was a large assortment of weaponry. Wasting no time, he wrenched a rifle and sheathed sword from the wall, stashed some ammunition, and took his leave, locking the armory door behind him. He left Governor House and set off down the hill. Brisbane still had an inferno fury burning from within, but his mind was now thinking more clearly, more calculatingly. Reaching a small, long-abandoned cottage at the base of the hill on which Governor House was perched, he peered inside to make sure no one had taken refuge in the cottage. From there, he rammed down the front door and, once inside, placed it precariously back where it belonged. He ran to and fro throughout the cottage until he found what he was searching for.
"Eureka!"
He exclaimed to himself as he steadied the ladder and climbed up into the attic. Brisbane groped about in the dark spaces until he presumed he was facing in the direction of the commotion, the rioting, and all of the hullabaloo. Mustering all of his strength from within, Brisbane flung his foot through the roof. Timber splattered out from the other side, leaving a perfect lookout post. It took no time to spot the coursing mass, altogether making significant headway through the thoroughfares of the colony. But there was something else, another group. Further off in the distance, there was a small red mass of soldiers in dazzling full-dress uniform. "Finally, at last," Brisbane muttered to himself. The battlefield was inundated with fallen men in uniform. The sight was making Brisbane's temple throb. He cursed under his tongue. Watching from afar was surreal. Time seemed to be suspended. There was a rhythmic movement of the mass as it weaved its way throughout the thoroughfares and towards freedom, like waves rushing from the shore and back out to sea. A man with a blonde, balding pate appeared within sight. It was Lieutenant Hicks. He moved towards the red mass, followed by at least 50 full-dressed reinforcements. Every soldier turned to Hicks as he gestured and waved about animatedly. It appeared he was issuing them with instructions. Then, without delay, the red mass disbanded, breaking apart into individual little red dots that weaved deviously throughout the passages of the colony, unnoticed by the mass of convicts. They grouped together near the colonial building, looking out upon the convicts, and then made their way in from the back entrance until there were no more uniformed soldiers in sight. Brisbane's heart began to pound. His temple began to throb. He sensed his moment of retribution was at hand, and he longed to be with his soldiers. Looking on with bated breath, he waited, and then it began. The scene that ensued was utter pandemonium. A chorus of rifle fire pierced fiercely through the air. Many convicts from within the mass fell. Their surviving comrades, outraged and bewildered, levelled their rifles on the nearby building and returned the gestures with spades. Timber splintered, windows shattered, glass exploded, and buildings were decimated. Uniformed men fell from where the windows had once been. Then all went silent. The bell rang no more. Moments went by, and then more moments. Suddenly the convicts cried out in delight. Brisbane yelled in fury and thumped his fist into the roof, accidentally creating a second hole and alerting a nearby onlooker to his presence. The coursing mass doubled its pace, rearing towards its escape that now seemed imminent, then gradually faded from view. Brisbane knew that the only way to see them now would be from Governor House. Throwing caution to the wind, he decided to set off from the attic and venture up the hill. His residence showed no signs of sabotage, and he felt reassured until a sound altogether quaint reached his ears. Galloping, he thought, and he spun around in time to see a dishevelled-looking man atop a horse with a fire in his eyes. Instinct took over, and before Brisbane knew it, he was clutching his rifle, pointed squarely at the convict's chest. His finger tensed on the trigger. Yet he waited until the man drew nearer before he fired. The shot missed. His nerves now scattered. Brisbane fired frantically once more, but the convict rode on. The horse bolted full pelt at Brisbane, and the dishevelled man lunged from it, landing straight on Brisbane, whose head found landing on the solid earth. Stars began to form, the world went blank, and Brisbane's head throbbed. A fist made clean contact with his jaw. The pain was excruciating. The weight of the man on top of him bore down upon him. Summoning all the strength he had remaining, Brisbane threw his knee into the man. They keeled over, drawing breath. Brisbane kicked at the convict from the ground, sending him rolling further away and out of harm's way. His heart was pounding, his head was spinning, his breath came in short and raspy. The moment of respite did Brisbane well, though, and he slowly returned to his feet, his eyes locked in with those of the convict. There was ferocity in those eyes that would shake even the most steadfast of men, but Brisbane forced himself to remain resolute. The convict jumped to his feet and drew a sword from his ragged clothes, brandishing it menacingly. Brisbane drew his own from its sheath and pointed it firmly at his enemy.
"Come on, Governor,"
said the convict with a wicked smile.
"let me show you the true meaning of punishment."
Both men gave charge. Their swords clashed as they manoeuvred about the battlefield in a fierce duel. The colony bell rang from the distant hill. The sounds of rioting filled the air, and occasional rifle fire punctuated the cacophony. But neither Brisbane nor his assailer registered any of these. Their sight was locked on one another and the swords that each wielded. Finally, their swords locked. Brisbane could sense every ounce of the convict's strength being channeled into pushing against his blade. He returned the gesture and slowly drove the dishevelled man towards a wall in the nearby distance. When he was within reach of the wall, Brisbane gripped both hands firmly on his sword's hilt. He mustered his strength and gave a tremendous push with all his might. The convict was sent flying backwards by the sheer force. He hit the brick wall, dropped his weapon, and crumpled to the ground. Knowing this was his moment of opportunity, Brisbane seized it and let loose with his sword. Stranded on the ground with nowhere to run, the convict stood no chance against the killing blow. Brisbane looked away. His body felt numb, weak. His sword slipped from his grasp. He felt himself slipping away. But the battle was not over yet, and the pandemonium of the rioting could still be heard from every spare space in the colony. Running on nothing more than willpower, and quite a considerable amount of it, Brisbane dragged his wounded body up the hill and onto the balcony of Governor House. Leaning on the balustrade for support, he looked out across the colony. There, on the outskirts, he spotted a formation of soldiers in perfect red uniforms, with Henry at their lead. They stood in a line formation that stretched across a great distance. The coursing mass of convicts approached the formation of soldiers and abruptly came to a halt. Their rioting fell silent. The colony bell rang no more and all went still. Aside from his laboured breath, there was nothing to be heard from where Brisbane stood. Then one red-uniformed man, letting his nerves get the better of him, let his weapon fly. In an instant, rifle fire erupted from both sides, enveloping the land in a thick cloud of smoke. When it cleared, he saw his men in their perfect formation, lying against the ground. Brisbane could not hold on any longer. His arms faltered, and he fell from the balustrade and onto the wooden floor of the balcony. There he lay in seething pain, drawing heavy breaths. He spat out, and from his distorted vision saw blood lying before him.
"Savages!"
He choked. As Brisbane began to pass out, he vowed that he would hunt down every remaining man, woman, and child who had escaped, just as he had done to the man now lying at the base of the hill. He would not rest, and would make them pay for what they had done. He would have his retribution. Their treachery could not be forgiven. He must...